I would like to welcome everyone to the Pediatric Formulation Workshop. My name is Steve Hoig, and I'm at the University of Maryland and one of the people helping organize this. There's a lot of people who really worked hard to make this an event, people like Dana Hamill and Jim Pauley and things. So we owe them a real debt of gratitude. Here are our sponsors, and I'll just do the logistics. If you have to go to the bathroom, you can either go left or right out this door, and there's a sign. Also, if you want the speaker's bio, they are online, and this handout you have has a QR code where you can see the detailed introduction of all the speakers. We will just do an abbreviated introduction. You should also have a program so that has the times and all the speakers. There's been a few last minute changes, but this should be fairly complete. And also notice that tomorrow, this starts a half hour early, so set your alarms a little bit earlier. There'll be lunch provided out in the back there, the same with the breakfast. There'll be a poster session in between, so you can go see the posters, and there's some exhibitors. And there will be, as I said, a lunch. And then this evening at the poster, what they call it, heavy hors d'oeuvres. So there'll be food so that you won't be hungry when reading the posters and talking to your colleagues. So without further, also there is the Wi-Fi password is on here. So if you want to hook up the guest Wi-Fi, you can hook up to that.
Timing. We're short on time.
Yeah, so I've been, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Trupti.
Thank you, Steve. I was just saying one more announcement. We have a very tight agenda, so please come back on time and stay on time for speakers so we can accomplish everything that we've set out to do.
Let's see. All right.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Hello, good morning, everyone. So nice to see all of you here. We're all gathered for this workshop with one common theme, common passion, shaping the future of pediatric formulation development. And I think we are over 100 participants representing industry, academia, and government. So we have a diverse group of people who are represented in this room to talk about pediatric formulation development. For some of us, the journey started more than a decade ago. The first workshop that we held as a group, the IQ Consortium's Pediatric Working Group, along with EUPFI and MCERC, was in 2016. We had another workshop, a follow workshop in 2019, and here we are for the third one. So really excited to have all of you here. And the hope is that we are able to foster a dialogue, to share some best practices, to identify some actionable strategies that can help accelerate advanced pediatric formulation development, specifically to develop safe, effective, and acceptable formulations. I mean, we have formulations, but are they acceptable for pediatric population is a big question mark. So you'll hear a lot about it in the next couple of days. Specifically, we hope then to really have a better understanding aligned with the patient caregiver voices, regulatory perspectives, and the developer's perspective. Share what we have learned through publications, hopefully in a reasonable amount of time, and then identify collaboration opportunities. I mean, like we said, we have a diverse group of people here, and the hope is we are able to network amongst the different groups, find ways in which we can collaborate so we have a synergistic approach to developing pediatric formulations. Not this way, the other way. So how do we hope to achieve that? So what we have done, and I'd like to really thank the planning committee for this, is developed a program of where we have tried to give a holistic perspective. So we have the patient and caregiver voice, which is the center of everything that we should be doing. We are really happy to have our guest speakers for that. We have the developer's perspective, where we talk about, yes, we understand what needs to happen, but what are the practical challenges, and what innovations are needed, and how can we try and overcome them. We have a regulator's perspective, who have laid down the standards for us, who have defined the regulatory pathways, and how they're working with the industry to really accelerate this development. And then we have people who can really talk about some collaborative opportunities, perhaps public-private partnerships, global collaboration, because that's another area where every region have their own rules and regulations that as an industry we have to follow. And it would really help if we have an alignment across the board there. So identifying the opportunities in those areas is what we are hoping to do here. So I think I don't want to take a lot of time, but I do want to really thank a lot of people. You saw the slide of our industry sponsors that Steve had put up. Really appreciate the generosity, which allowed us the flexibility to really put all this together. Our host, obviously, Cersei, Dana, and Jim, who've been really instrumental in helping us with their expertise and support in pulling all this together. Melissa has been our liaison for the sponsors, so thank you to all of them. Our planning committee, we had a huge planning committee, and I think we've come up with a program that is really robust and inclusive. So couldn't have done without the representation from our colleagues in FDA, IQ Consortium's Pediatric Working Group, the EU PFI membership, and also NIH, NIAID specifically, who have helped bring in some speakers and really put the program together. And last but not the least, all of you. If you're not here, we wouldn't have engaging and productive workshops. So really excited for the next 2 days. I hope it is a stimulating and productive use of everyone's time. Really looking forward to it. So thank you all, and let's get started. So while Steve is setting up, I'll introduce our next speaker, John Alexander from FDA. He was also part of our planning committee and has contributed a lot already to pull all this together. And John, really excited for your talk. Thank you.
So, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. My name is John Alexander. I'm the Deputy Director for the Division of Pediatrics and Maternal Health at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. And I know that's a mouthful. My talk this morning is about pediatric formulations and what is needed. I'm hoping that this is going to whet your appetites a little bit for the coming sessions that we have over the next couple of days. So these are my disclosures. I think it's important to let you know that the views expressed here are my own and aren't necessarily representative of FDA policy. I don't speak policy off of the top of my tongue, but hopefully you'll get a better understanding, a little bit of the perspective of a regulator and some of the things that I think are important. I have no financial disclosures. So I also wanted to offer my welcome to everyone for to this workshop. I also wanted to offer my thanks to Trupti, to Daniel, to Jim and Steve, and all of the members of the committee, the IQ Consortium, the Cersei folks, who all got together in order to arrange this workshop. I think it is a testament to all their efforts to sort of move this forward, because we recognize that it had been a long time since our last workshop in 2019. And I think, unfortunately, some of the topics are similar or the same, and some of the topics are still new. But I think that progress is incremental, and hopefully we'll continue to make progress. So for my talk, I'm going to talk about considerations for pediatric formulations and try and outline sort of examples of what I think is needed to be considered in pediatric formulations. And this comes from my perspective, both as a pediatrician as well as someone who's been working at FDA for now over 30 years in pediatric drug development. But next, let me go into a brief moment in history. In 1937, elixir of sulfanilamide was first marketed in the United States. It contained a preparation of sulfanilamide that included 10% sulfanilamide, 72% diethylene glycol, and 16% water. The preparation was not tested before it was marketed, so there were no evaluations of safety. The product started marketing early in 1937, and by the October, it was recognized that there were a total of 105 deaths associated with the use of this elixir of sulfanilamide, which included 34 children. The deaths were associated with renal failure, with recognition from animal studies of the development of and I think post-mortem as well, of a vacuolar nephropathy, as it was described. And death was recognized in a mean of 9.4 days, which ranged from 2 to 22 days. The reference that I provide at the bottom of the slide is where most of this information is coming from. But there were a total of 240 gallons of the elixir of sulfanilamide that were produced. And almost 228 gallons were eventually recovered before it was administered to patients. But that recovery of the thing was based on a technicality, because this product was labeled as an elixir but did not contain any alcohol, and that was the sole basis that FDA had for considering this product as misbranded at the time. I think it's important to recognize that the occurrence of these deaths contributed to the ultimate passage of the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which was the first place where we started, where the government started requiring the evaluation of safety of drugs in a new drug application. I noted the reference here from 1995 from the Annals of Internal Medicine, because I want to point out why I think this is important to today. Because what we find is that history is repeating itself. The 1995 article was in part initiated because of the fact that in 1990, it was recognized that there were 40 children in Nigeria that died from renal failure when diethylene glycol was also used in an acetaminophen syrup preparation for children. And the same article noted several other events prior to that also involved either diethylene glycol or ethylene glycol as an excipient in a formulation. So in 1969, there were 7 children in Cape Town where the excipient was included as part of a sedative. In 1985, there were 5 burn patients who died when in Spain when sulfur-selvadiazine, which is a topical preparation, included diethylene glycol as an excipient. And then in 1986, there were 14 children in Bombay where glycerin was administered and had the same excipient. And it continues. Most recently, there were in 2022 and 2023, 6 alerts about diethylene glycol or ethylene glycol contamination of over-the-counter medicines in a variety of countries: Gambia, Cameroon, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and others that were associated with, again, this type of contamination. So I think it's important that that it be recognized that this contamination continues to happen, and so when you end up doing some testing of propylene glycol drug substance or excipient for your what you're planning on in terms of drug product manufacturing, or when you're doing some other DEG or EG testing, I want you to recognize this story as part of the reason why. So in terms of then what's needed for pediatric formulations, I think safety first. And we'll talk a lot about other things. I recognize that this is sort of an extreme example. And one of the things to recognize here as well is that this not only affected children, but adults as well. So this was something that was much more easily recognized, but comes into a concern that we'll talk a lot more about over the coming days with regards to excipients. So then switching gears, I want to focus a little bit more on pediatric issues specifically. In pediatric development, both physical development as well as growth are both factors, and development can affect what has effects in multiple ways. So one of the classics is the ontogeny of different metabolic pathways, and benzyl alcohol, which will also be mentioned again later in this session, is one of the classic examples. So understanding that there's a difference in the way that drugs or excipients are metabolized in the pediatric population is an important factor to consider when you're thinking about developing a pediatric formulation. Maturation of organ systems is also different. We do recognize that, for instance, the kidney development is different, and that may in fact have an effect on the potential toxicity of either drugs or excipients in the pediatric population, so it can contribute to the risk overall. It's important to recognize that children are not just small adults, and the same is true for neonates not just being small children. There are more excipient concerns as you go younger in age. Neonates are often considered as a sort of protected population, and the idea that what we are doing is best to avoid trying to do any studies in the pediatric population, the neonatal population, has been a problem all along that we need to get over. And the idea that we can move forward best by sort of understanding what the potential risks are, and then making sure that when we're looking at formulations that we're making those considerations prior to making those products available. So one of the things that I think is important that's needed is recognition of the developmental effects in children. Pediatric growth is a separate consideration here. And what I'm showing is one of the CDC growth charts for girls, and I've focused on the lower portion. So this is for children from 2 to 18 years of age, and looking at weight specifically. I think it's important to recognize that when we're talking about an adult product, what we are looking at in terms of adults is usually this part of the range. So the weight, the adult weight range is about 45 to 85 kilograms for girls. It's a little bigger for males, but when you're talking about then the pediatric age range for looking at this chart, you're not only covering that adult range of weights, you're also going down to about 8 kilos, and that's just for children 2 years of age and older. That's not counting those less than 2 years. There are separate growth charts for children that are less than 36 months, so from birth to 36 months, and that's, in fact, another factor of magnitude in terms of differences in weight in that age range. And so what's important here to recognize is that when you're looking at dosing, one of the things to think about in terms of development of drugs is to recognize how much of a difference in weight you might need to be giving, how much of a difference in weight there might be in the patients that you're treating. And that's part of what needs to go into the thinking about how you provide flexible dosing to this population. I will say, with regards to the CDC growth charts, I think all of you should become familiar with them. We use them all the time to look at things like questions of when we're looking at a drug and it's intended for a population that would be pediatric patients from 8 years old onward. One of the things that we look at is looking at the growth chart to understand how much of a difference in weight range we might need to cover for that particular product. And that's sort of an easy way to sort of try and think about what kind of differences in weight might I need to account for when I'm looking at trying to develop a drug for that pediatric age group. So again, in terms of what is needed, really dosing flexibility is needed. And then we get to the big topic of palatability and acceptability of formulations. Even the most effective medicines aren't going to work in somebody who won't take it. Most children's hospitals have websites that address techniques for administration of medication. So it speaks to how difficult this issue is. And there are aspects of formulation, particularly palatability, that are important to think about, and that the development of formulations that are thinking about how these medications are given would be important. I was dealing with something at work just last week where we're dealing with the question of a formulation that is really bitter on the, really bad on the bitterness scale. And the formulation was being looked at in first a liquid formulation and then looked at in terms of an orally disintegrating tablet, because they're looking at trying to give this to children down to birth. And what we need, I think, in that instance is to look at alternative formulations, because how much more difficult is it going to be to give a medication that's bitter when you're actually trying to develop a formulation that is going to deliver it directly to the mouth, instead of what they did in adults, which was to make sure that the tablet was coated so that it wasn't tasted as it went down. these alternative strategies like coding that are used in adults should signal the need to rethink what you're doing in terms of the pediatric formulation. And so again, what is needed, I think here in this example, is alternative formulations. And I do think that there's other examples that we could talk about where there needs to be some rational thinking about the way that a formulation is developed and how to target it to the population that actually needs these alternative formulations. So in summary, there are many pediatric considerations that are important in pediatric formulation development, and I'm hoping that over the next few days, we're going to have interesting sessions talking about some of those things and getting people to recognize what they might need to think about doing differently. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. That was really a nice presentation. Our next speaker, Joanna, is going to talk about, is going to present the industry perspective. She's representing the IQ Pediatric Working Group. Her daytime job is with Gilead. So thank you.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Okay, great, because I tend to wonder and I don't want to rely on this microphone. If you stop hearing me, just wave your arms and I'll know what's going on. So thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. I think you see a lot of familiar faces. It almost feels like a reunion. So happy to see everybody. So maybe John started with the disclaimer. I don't have a written disclaimer, but I just want to say that opinions here are mine, not Gilead opinions and not IQ opinions, but they were formed based on the conversation that I had with my colleagues from industry at the IQ forum and various other forums as well. Okay, so in preparation for today's talk, if I can advance the slides. Oh, this is not working. The dongle is plugged.
Back in.
That is not working either.
Here. Sometimes you got to get the right window.
Okay, perfect. Sorry for that. So in preparation for today's talk, I really wanted to go a little bit to the history and look back where we were in our previous conversation here at this forum at the MCRC. So as John already mentioned in Trupti, I think actually mentioned, we met, this is our third meeting. We met in 2016, 2019, and now 2026, which gives us a nice window, a decade to look back and see what progress we actually have made, what was driven by those discussions. And as already, I think John mentioned that unsurprisingly, there's a couple of themes that kind of theme through all our conversations, and those include age appropriateness of the formulations, choice of excipients, how do we dose the drugs, the devices, biopharmaceutics and PK considerations. What's exciting today also during this workshop that we're going to be talking about new evolutions of AI and ML and how that can potentially exponentially help us develop and progress the field of pediatric development. One thing that was very clear when I was looking back at the conversation, summary of conversations, that we are making progress. We actually started by defining the challenges, but then we started aligning quickly on solutions. And now you're going to see that we're actually implementing some of the solutions. Of course, many of problems are going to persist, and we have to continue working together to move the field forward. At the last meeting in the 2019, I think we aligned in a number of different aspects. One of them being that adolescents are pretty much, I know children are not small adults, but adolescents may be a small adult. So for the most part, they can leverage the existing pediatric adult formulation. So let's focus on the youngest patients. And particularly neonates were highlighted as the population that still needs a lot of careful consideration, and there's a lot of unknowns for pediatrics, including safety of excipients, but also PK considerations and other factors. We also highlighted that there's lack of standardization in how we test our formulations, for example, with foods. We want to make sure that caregivers are given an array of options. We know when children don't want to take medication, caregivers going to do and dose the drugs with whatever they have available, they know the child is going to take. So how do we enable a collection of the data, and how can we do better to actually give that flexibility? We also talked about acceptability and the fact that the tools that we have are not harmonized. The formulators or an industry doesn't necessarily know if the tools they are using are going to be acceptable from a regulatory point of view. And it's hard for us to really combine and pull the data that is in the literature just because we're using the different tools. And there we highlighted some implementation challenges with dosing accuracy devices, particularly feeding tubes for the smallest of the patients. And this is where I wanted to go back and see, okay, what have we done? Have we actually accomplished any of those challenges? Those who know me, I know I spent 20 years doing a formulation development, so I think I had to start with the formulation and the progress we made there. I think most of us, I hope, will agree that mini tablets really are emerging as the platform of choice. We've done a lot of focused research and development in that area. It is the platform that increasingly has been shown to be acceptable to very young patients, including infants. Obviously, there have to be considerations. Those mini tablets may have to be oral dispersible, so we're reducing the risk of choking. But it is really one platform that can serve really wide range of patient weights and age. It provides a lot of flexibility in dosing. The mini tablets can be dosed directly in the mouth, can be mixed with food. If you formulate them as oral dispersible tablet, it can be served in solution or suspension. Has high acceptability. There's a lot of literature, and I'll refer to that a little bit later, showing acceptability of mini tablets in various patients groups. Obviously, it's operational advantages. We know how to tablet, just making smaller tablets. Yes, there will be technical challenges, but we have excellent scientists and engineers, and we can overcome those challenges at this point. And they've gotten regular traction. I think you see more and more mini tablet products on the market. Currently in the US, I found we counted 14 unique approved products. And I believe there's 8 currently in clinical trials. So I think we'll see the upward trend. I think we get the platform settled. Another area that have seen tremendous growth, especially when you look at the literature, is studying acceptability. Now, I want to highlight that it's acceptability for oral products. When I did very quick cursory research, I found approximately 300 unique publications that were talking about acceptability of oral pediatric formulations. A great majority of these were in areas of palatability and swallowability, which I think we agree that are probably 2 of the most important factors in product acceptability for pediatric patients. We also developed novel and different methodologies. So we have a number of different tools that we can leverage to test acceptability in children. Now, one of the studies that actually caught my eye is referenced here, the children's perspective on acceptability of medicines. The reason I found it intriguing is because the authors here actually noted that children have very good cognitive ability to provide nuanced feedback on product acceptability. But what sets this tool and proposed framework apart is that it actually leverages children's emotional response to the drug. It really looks into the context the child is, the individual context, their history and of taking various medicines. And they found that it's actually a pretty important factor in whether a child is going to accept medicine. And actually reading that study, it reminded me really very interesting talk at the UPFI many, many years ago, but Professor Charles Spence from, I think he's in experimental psychology at University of Oxford, fascinating research that he does. And he shared one experiment where he visually has shown children various size tablets, color, size, shapes. And he had the children rank order the tablets in the order of bitterness. And now, bear in mind, none of those children tested any of those tablets. These are all pictures. But it was surprisingly consistent response on certain visuals that children perceive as bitter. And actually, a lot of his research is in area of nutrition and food. But he's shown over and over that we can react to the same food very differently depending on the context that food is presented. So the element of having emotional response to the drugs actually resonated with me quite a bit in this research. Highly fascinating research. Dr. Spence, very, very recommend you guys go and take a look at that. I think you're not going to look at the food the same way again in the restaurants. Talking about the bitter, I think this is one of the fields that is most exciting to me. Is actually something innovative is happening for pediatric development in the excipient space. there's actually quite a bit of number of researchers looking at the idea of universal beta blockers. Now, the concept is very simple. You find a small, grass-safe excipient that is ideally very potent. You can put a little bit in the formulation, and it actually blocks all the bitterness of all the drugs. In reality, of course, it's much more complicated than that. And in fact, starting with the fact that we have over 25 different bitter taste receptors. And so while a number of different molecules have been identified as being able to block certain receptors and diminish or reduce bitterness of various drugs, there's no one universal compound that is appropriate for formulation development that would hit the target yet. However, the researchers from the Monell Institute recently have reported that you can target a receptor downstream of bitter receptor and actually can block all taste sensations for a period of time. Now, this is very early research. Probably a little bit easier than targeting the bitter receptors, I think, in my naive mind. I think we're going to have somebody in the panel here from Monell Institute, so there's a poster so we can talk to them. But I'm going to be watching that area very closely. I think it's very promising research. One thing that also got me thinking, as pharma industry, we have leveraged learnings from other industries. We have learned to lyophilize, freeze dry from our food industry. We have leveraged hot melt extrusion from other industry. Why aren't we looking at the food industry and their experts in sensory sciences? I think they have decades and decades of research modulating taste perception. And in fact, some of them actually reaching out to pharma and providing tools that can potentially help formulators in that aspect. And just one example, Modulescence Bitter was recently announced by DSM Firmenich. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, but it's two big conglomerates. They are famous in health sciences, food industry, food industry, flavor houses. And so they combine their sensory expertise with their developed bitter blockers and flavoring agents to help formulators overcome some of the challenges. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't speak about the excipients. I think I don't have to introduce STEP database. It's a cornerstone in our toolbox. Is the tool that every formulator goes to when they think about pediatric formulation development and they want to learn about the safety of the excipients. Since 2019, the database grew tremendously. There's now 75 excipients that information is collated for. And actually, there are some very exciting things that are going to happen in the database. So stay tuned. I think Smita is going to talk to us about it tomorrow. IQ Consortium, AUP5 co-developed PARA tool. You might also be familiar with that tool. It provides a nice framework for really risk-based assessment on choice of excipients for pediatric formulations. What I'm excited to hear tomorrow is how FDA is leveraging AI for evaluation of excipients in pediatric formulations. Now, I recognize that the tool may not be available to collect information and take it outside of the regulatory walls, but I'm hopeful that in the future, as those tools evolve, they're going to be able to kind of mine the data the regulators have access to in some way and fashion to maybe pull some of the information that can be shared with developers without obviously compromising proprietary information. And one of the exciting things as well announced in 2021 was FDA's review pilot program for reviewing new excipients. I know that several excipients have been accepted to this program. I don't believe we officially heard yet the results. But the reason that's exciting is for industries, as you know, novel excipients are needed for novel formulations, and development programs are already highly expensive, take a lot of time, they carry a lot of risks. And so industry will be pretty reluctant on bringing new excipients that have not been pre-reviewed in some way or fashion by regulators. There's too high of a regulatory risk. So if that pilot is successful, I think that's something we're going to be closely watching for and hoping that we can then leverage some of the innovation that is happening in excipient industry. Regarding dosing accuracy and administrations, I think one of the most exciting opportunities for industry is, I think, development of the standardized kind of media that could mimic food vehicles. as I already mentioned, we want to provide caregivers a wide variety of options for dosing with foods. We want to make sure that when drugs are being mixed with food, they don't impact drug performance, right? That there's a high risk that they might. But how do we do that in a standardized way? And I think if we can one day off the shelf buy a media that simulates applesauce and with variety of parameter ranges that we know that this food can have from vendor to vendor, even between different lots of, frankly, different one food from one vendor, that would simply simplify analytical testing and ensure more safety and efficacy in one-day range of foods being available for children. Maybe I want to highlight a little bit about device innovation. Of course, there's a lot going on there, but this is by no means extensive research. A few things that I want to highlight, maybe the development of low-volume oral syringe. That syringe was co-developed by one of the hospital consortiums with Medline, I believe it's a company. That oral syringe can dose accurately to 0.01 ml. That's 1/10 of a drop. So now when we talk about neonates and accuracy of dosing, this is the type of innovation that we really need to be looking at. Another thing, example, the Markwordt integrated autoinjector. That's actually a company that's in development. They're looking for funding. Maybe I want to pull that example because as a mother of a child who's got allergies, life-threatening allergies, I know how hard it is for my child to carry EpiPen with them. But one thing I know that they'll never leave the house without a phone. So if you have a small cassette-like autoinjector that you can smack on the back of your phone, I know it's always going to be with her everywhere. So again, those are the level of innovation that really excites me and I'm looking forward to. Of course, I want to mention clinical trials because there's a lot of operational challenges in the pediatric clinical trial execution. And while none of these are pediatric specific, they will benefit pediatric studies. So study designs like adaptive study design. If we can have predefined change to the clinical plan based on interim data, we have flexibility in testing the formulations. If there is acceptability of PK impact, and we can quickly switch. We can drop ineffective arms, so that reduces number of children needed for the study. We all know that the population is pretty fragmented and very small. So anything we can do to minimize number of children enrolled in the studies is going to facilitate the trials. And similar, the master protocols and platform trials. Once you pull the infrastructure for the studies, you can minimize number of placebo arms, for example. So then you're reducing the exposure of children to placebo, and you need less children to enroll for that trial. I think earlier inclusion in pediatrics in the trials, it's definitely taken off. I think at least what I see is that adolescents are often now included either in the adult trials or in parallel with adult trials, so that patient population is going to be addressed much faster. And there is some movement in parallel enrollments for various age groups. Of course, that depends on the therapeutic area and the drug, but the faster we can enroll children in less sequential fashion, the faster we can make products available to children. Leveraging MIDDs and extrapolated efficacy from adults when appropriate also facilitates the pediatric trials. And then COVID. I think we've demonstrated during COVID that when we want, we can pull our research together and be very creative. And the expansion of the decentralized trials, the digital endpoints, really enable fast development during COVID. And if we can leverage these for pediatric product development, we can access the children who have hard time, for example, far away from the clinic, and reduce the burden on caregivers and children coming into the clinic during school days, et cetera. So some of the positive develops. Obviously, a lot more work to be done in this space. Like I said, none of these were developed for pediatrics, but I think we can start leveraging these for pediatric trials. So I've shared some of the progress we've done. Again, by all no means was it in-depth. I just picked a couple areas where I want to show a few examples. But what remains unsolved? One of the challenges that we see in industry that while the regulations evolve as they should, they're pretty, when you look at a global scale, they're pretty complicated, and there persist to be discrepancies in data expectations and timing that really make it hard for us to take off the ground one clinical program very rapidly. So these unfortunately still persist. And once pediatric commitments are set in place, it's really hard to make changes. And even when the science evolves, even when there is a better product out there, we're still working on splitting our resources on multiple different products rather than focusing on the one product that at that point in time probably would benefit the patients the most. On the scientific front, I think, I don't need to say it, but I'm going to say neonates still remain the most underserved patient population. I think this is probably one of the focus areas I would advocate for us to put a lot of resources to and start focusing on it. And I'll speak a little bit more about dosage forms and excipients in sequential slides. One of the advances that I've seen recently in formulation development is advent of long-acting injectables. Now we've moved away from simple oil-based depots. Those are becoming much more complex formulation. The good thing about it is that while there's increased complexity, we're able to actually very fine-tune PK of those molecules by molecular design and formulation design. And now we can dose, extend durations from weeklies to monthlies to quarterly to every 6 months to even once a year injections. Of course, those are very beneficial for chronic diseases. We've seen advent of those in CNS diseases, in HIV, diabetes, and preventative therapies. Now, because the frequency of dosing is significantly reduced, it increases adherence and it provides better outcomes for the patients. And who could benefit from this the most? Of course, pediatric patients. Now, the challenges are, what do we know about acceptability of parenteral products in peds? And the reality is not much. I think we've focused a lot of effort in oral products. We haven't done much in parenteral space. Now, all what's known is probably from the low volume, aqueous, low viscosity vaccines. Large needle gauges, small needles. But those formulations, long-acting formulations, and maybe high concentration protein therapeutics are very different these days. Very highly concentrated viscous. They require large needles. They require sometimes deep IM injections, large volumes, multiple injections. How can we enable those products to be serving patient populations, pediatrics, if we don't understand what's acceptable? We don't even really have tools to measure acceptability of parenteral products. We know that children are going to be talking emotional response. They're going to be afraid of needles. They're going to feel pain during injections. Now, if we have those large depot-based formulations, there's no way around. We're going to have foreign body response. There will be some local tolerability considerations as well. So how do we ensure that we collect the data and get more information? I think this is a big gap for us. Excipients, something we've talked about, we're talking about, and we're probably going to be talking all in the future. We still need more data. We are generating data. There's some publications that have come out in the last couple of years, primarily focused on excipients that we already know have safety limitations. Yes, the data is important because it gives us a little bit more information and gives us some nuanced information. But we really need more data. And hopefully over the next 2 days, we're going to have some conversations. How can we enable? How can we pool? We know that companies have data. We know the regulators have bulk of the data. How can we creatively think of getting the data out there that doesn't, again, disclose proprietary information, but enables all of us to advance the field? Operation challenges in clinical settings, I think those are going to persist. There are some challenges we're not going to be able to solve. We know the patient population is fragmented. There's not a lot of the patients. We're going to be competing for patients in some trials. And there's a lot of different factors, right? We cannot, for example, increase the blood draw volumes. We cannot increase drug blood volume frequency. But we can find better analytical methods to get more data out of the smaller samples. So what can we actually tackle out of all of these challenges and align on and move the field forward? I think this is the area where needs a little bit of alignment of where we can go next. So where do we go next? If I had a magic wand and I could pick one, well, I'll ask for 2 things. One would be the neonates. Let's focus on neonates. Let's pick area where we can actually start making some incremental changes. And the other one would be, let's figure out how we can understand pediatric acceptability for parenteral products. Those would be two of my wishes. And for that to happen, we do have to continue working together, whether it's industry, regulators, excipients, various organizations, industry, everybody. We need to work together. We need to stay focused. We need to align what we want to go. And if we focus and align, I think we're going to be able to get there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Wonderful presentation laying out where we are today and the challenges of tomorrow. Hand it over to now Khurana to set us up for the first session.
I can't get rid of it.
Sounds good. All right. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right. Welcome to session 1A. My name is Mona Khurana. I'm a team leader in the Division of Pediatrics and Maternal Health in CEDAR at FDA. And I will be co-leading this session with Dr. Trupti Dixit. The goal of this session is to get a better understanding about the practical constraints with existing formulations that are available for pediatric use, and to learn how such challenges are currently being addressed by parents and healthcare providers in order to be able to deliver the intended dose to pediatric patients. In this session, you will be hearing from parents about their personal experiences. You'll be hearing from pediatric pharmacists about their patient practices, and from regulators at FDA's Office of Compounding Quality and Compliance. Collectively, their unique perspectives will speak to the importance of having a patient-centric approach to pediatric formulation development, which we will begin to tackle over these next 2 days. So we're going to get things started in this session with our two parent advocates, beginning first with Crystal Grogan. Crystal's personal experience with her son requiring neonatal intensive care led to her current and ongoing professional advocacy work within the neonatal community, where she frequently speaks about the importance of integrating the parent perspective into healthcare design and decision-making. Crystal also serves in a cross-functional role supporting global marketing, advocacy, and stakeholder engagement initiatives at Prolacta Bioscience. We are pleased to have her here today as part of the International Children's Advisory Network to provide the parents' perspective about medication usability, dosing flexibility, palatability, and the practical realities of administering medication to a child. Crystal.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. As Mona said in the introduction, my name is Crystal Grogan, and unlike many of the people in this room, I am not a formulation scientist. I am not a pharmacist or a clinician or an industry leader or any regulatory official of any sort. I'm a mom, and for nearly 15 years, my son Seth and I have been navigating the reality of giving and taking medications that weren't often designed with children like him in mind. So today I'd like to share what medication administration looks like from our kitchen counter rather than from a laboratory. So this is Seth. When Seth was born, I never imagined the day that I'd be standing here in front of you speaking about pediatric medications. But like many of the surprises and the twists and turns in the paths I never thought we'd be on, here we are. And Seth has survived many challenges I never imagined we'd face, including sepsis, surgical necrotizing enterocolitis, and life-threatening cardiac events. And needless to say, he lives with complex medical needs that require me to remain hypervigilant in every way imaginable. Seth has cerebral palsy, autism, seizure disorders, and a long list of coexisting chronic issues that go along with each one of those. And for the past 15 years, medications have become a rigorous part of our lives. And over that time, I've administered medications in several different ways as Seth's needs have changed and grown along with him. And what I've learned the most is getting my hands on the medication is only the beginning. Getting it into my child safely, accurately, and consistently is often where the challenges really begin. And almost every medication Seth has been prescribed looked really simple and straightforward on paper. Medication is prescribed, it's administered, and then Seth either gets better or the symptoms are treated and he does better. It's simple, except it really isn't, because for families like mine, challenges begin after the prescription is written. So this slide's what I call a view from our kitchen counter. When people think about a parent giving their child a dose of medication, they often picture a prescription bottle and a caregiver giving them their proper dose. And I wish it was that simple. But nobody hands you a manual for all the little problems that you run into. What you're looking at isn't a collection of supplies, it's a collection of solutions. Every syringe is there because something needed to be measured. Every notebook is there because something needed to be remembered. Every medication bag is there because something needed to be transported between two households or two caregivers. And every timer is there because something needed to happen at the exact time. And none of these were prescribed. They all appeared somewhere along the line because I encountered a problem that I had to find a way to solve. And this is part of medication administration that rarely gets discussed. It's not usually visible in the clinical trial, and it's not visible in the package insert, but it's very visible inside of our homes. One challenge that goes unrecognized is that medication administration doesn't just happen in isolation. Parents aren't just simply giving medications. We're coordinating care. Information has to move in between households, in between schools, in between families, in between anyone who might be responsible for Seth's care. And sometimes those people need to teach somebody else. So in my instance, Seth's dad may need to explain his medication to another caregiver. A school nurse may need to explain this to a substitute, and a respite provider might need to step in unexpectedly. Every person in this diagram needs to understand enough information to make sure that Seth is given the correct medications in the appropriate times in the correct ways. And every time something changes, the information has to move with it. And so I don't just have to learn it, I have to teach it. And if I'm being honest, there have been times when it's felt easier just to keep Seth at home and kind of isolated than to send him somewhere else. Not because I don't trust the people that are caring for him, it's just because giving Seth's medication sometimes becomes so complicated that teaching it has felt overwhelming. Every medication change means retraining. Every dose adjustment means new instructions. Every formulation change means new questions. And as you know all too well, as children grow, their needs also change. And every one of those changes has to be communicated clearly to everyone involved. And every time I hand that responsibility over to another caregiver, I worry if I've explained it well enough. I hope that I've remembered everything, and I lay awake at night hoping I didn't miss something important. And this kind of makes me laugh because before preparing for this workshop, I didn't know the actual word excipient. And I'm glad I did because I heard it about 50 times in the last hour. But I've been experimenting realistically with excipients and living with the effects of excipients for 15 years. And that's because I've learned the hard way that the active ingredient isn't the whole story. It's the coating, it's the coloring, it's the flavoring, it's the texture. These details matter. And I've seen Seth react differently to different colorings and different textures. And I've watched medications change manufacturers and suddenly behave differently. I've crushed tablets that dissolve beautifully, and others that seem determined to become concrete, explode like a middle school school volcano science project, or have beads spill across the countertop. I've watched medications stick to the sides of syringes, settle to the bottom of cups, cling to tubing. And every time that happens, the same questions start running through my mind. Like, how much medication is Seth really getting? How much is left behind? Should I be concerned? Am I doing it correctly? And while the active ingredient may not have changed, the experience of getting to a point where I can get it safely and completely administered into Seth absolutely has changed. So one clear example that I can give of this is Seth's current seizure medication. As the dose increased, this medication changed. Not just the amount of the medication, the size of the medication, the coatings all changed, the color changed, the taste changed, the way they crushed changed. And suddenly I found myself standing at the kitchen counter again, asking questions I never expected to ask. If I cut this tablet in half and part of it turns to powder, how much medication was actually lost? And if some of it sticks to the crusher, did he get the full dose? And if residue is left behind in the cup, does that matter? And if some remains inside the syringe, should I start over? And perhaps the most frightening question of all, am I helping Seth? Or am I actually causing him harm? And none of these, of course, are scientific questions by any means. They're all caregiver questions, but they're questions that families like mine ask themselves every single day, multiple times a day. And I think another misconception is that giving medication to your child becomes routine. I mean, sometimes it does for a while until it doesn't again. And there have been days when I'm tired, really tired. And nights when I've had multiple medications to prepare, multiple schedules to manage, and multiple people depending on me to get everything right. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, I've been interrupted and couldn't remember if I'd already crushed or given a medication or not. And at that point, what do? Do I keep going? Do I just guess? Or do I throw everything away and start over? And so many times I've just made that decision to start over, not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't risk getting it wrong. But, that means wasted medication, additional costs, additional stress. And, families routinely are creating these workarounds. We spent a lot of times figuring out things as we go. We crush tablets, we open capsules, we mix medications, we create schedules, we write instructions, we train caregivers, we troubleshoot problems, we monitor reactions, we document changes, we second guess what we've already double checked, and then we go back and double check that again, just in case we're missing something. And families are constantly trying to understand interactions. Do these medications need to be spaced apart? Can they be given together? Should this medication be given with food, without food? Will it affect absorption of another one? Will changing the formulation or the compounding change how it behaves? Most parents aren't pharmacists. We're making these decisions every single day. And at one point, I became so concerned about making errors that I decided to install a camera on my workstation to record medication preparation and administration, and not because anybody asked me to or even suggested it. I just wanted a way to go back and verify exactly what I had prepared if I had any questions of what had been given, and whether I'd administered everything correctly. I personally needed a concrete way to make sure I hadn't forgotten something, to make sure I hadn't made a misstep, to make sure I could trust myself. And I don't think I'm unique. This level of vigilance isn't uncommon amongst families managing complex medication schedules. Parents often become medication engineers without formal training. And most of us are doing these things because we want to, or most of us aren't doing these things because we want to. You know, there's no club that we signed up to because this really sounded fun to do. We're doing this because we have no other option. Families aren't asking for perfection. We're asking for practicality. We want pediatric formulations from the start, better taste and texture, true compatible options, consistency across strengths, clear administration guidelines, consideration of acceptance, and opportunities for caregivers to provide input earlier in the development process. Because we're often the people implementing these solutions dose after dose after dose. And that's why we're here today. Every challenge I've described represents an opportunity to do better. And this room is filled with individuals who have the ability to solve problems that many families don't even realize should be solvable. And if we know better, we need to do better. Because every problem we solve doesn't just improve a formulation, it gives families something back. It gives us more confidence, more independence, less fear of getting it wrong, and most importantly, more time with our children. Scientists may define success as stability, bioavailability, or regulatory approval. Families define success a little differently. Success means getting every dose correctly. Success means that caregivers feel confident and the instructions are clear and no one is frantically improvising or questioning what they're doing, and that the medication fits our daily lives. And today I've shared what pediatric medication administration looks like from one family's perspective. And like many families, we've spent years adapting, modifying, documenting, teaching, troubleshooting, and creating workarounds to help Seth receive the medications he needs. My hope is that as we continue these conversations throughout this workshop, we keep asking not only whether a formulation can be developed, but whether it can be successfully used by the children and families who depend on them. Because from a family's perspective, success isn't when caregivers become experts at workarounds. And I want to say that again so it kind of sticks in the back of your minds. Success isn't when caregivers become experts at workarounds. Success is when children receive medications that were designed for them and designed for the realities and the lives of the families who administer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal, for sharing your thoughts with us today. As we're teeing up the next slides, I'm going to introduce our next parent advocate, Melanie Turen. Melanie's personal experience caring for her son, who has a gastrojejunostomy feeding tube, led to her advocacy work with the International Children's Advisory Network. Please join me in welcoming Melanie as she shares a parent's perspective on the innovations required to prepare and administer enteral medications, drawing from her own extensive journey with her son and her active engagement with parent communities. These are the wrong slides. Dominic Markwordt. Dominic is a regulatory counsel in the Office of Compounding Quality and Compliance in CEDAR at FDA. As a member of the compounding staff in the Division of Compounding 3, he works to develop and implement human drug compounding initiatives. And today he's going to be providing FDA's regulatory framework for compounding.
Slides. Okay, great. Oh, there we go.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. As you heard, my name is Dominic Markwordt, and I'm a regulatory counsel, and I work in the Food and Drug Administration in our Center for Drug Evaluation and Research in our Office of Compounding Quality and Compliance. And today I'll be talking about the regulatory framework for drug compounding, or Compounding 101. So I'll discuss today basics of human drug compounding. Then I'll talk a little bit about the history of drug compounding and the Drug Quality and Security Act, the most recent legislation related to compounding. I'll talk a little bit about the frameworks for compounding under sections 503A and 503B of the FD&C Act. And then I'll talk a little bit about our evaluation process for bulk drug substances that have been nominated for use in compounding. So what is human drug compounding? Human drug compounding is generally regarded as the practice of when a licensed pharmacist or a licensed physician, or in the case of an outsourcing facility, a pharmacist or someone under the direct supervision of a pharmacist, combines, mixes, or develops a medication tailored to the needs of an individual patient. And they do that because an FDA-approved drug isn't available. Some of the basics about compounding. It's important to know that compounded drugs are not FDA approved. And so they are kind of an exception to the general principle that drugs cannot be introduced into interstate commerce unless they've been approved by FDA. So they are not FDA approved, but nonetheless lawfully marketed if they meet all the requirements of the statute. If a drug has not been approved by FDA, that means it has not been reviewed by FDA for quality, for safety, or efficacy. However, these drugs, these compounded drugs, if they meet certain conditions, can qualify for certain exceptions from certain provisions of the FD&C Act that other drugs need to meet. And compounded drugs can serve an important role for patients whose clinical needs cannot be met by FDA-approved drugs. And we heard some of the speakers earlier today talk about, especially in the pediatric space, maybe there is no FDA-approved drug available because you're doing weight-based dosing, or there's, concerns with ease of administration or patient compliance because of the bitterness of the drug. And even though they're a tool in the toolbox of clinicians, compounded drugs are not without risk. And there have been many cases, unfortunately, where due to poor or improper compounding practices, patients have been harmed. Another thing to know is that states generally are the ones that have the primary regulatory authority over state licensed pharmacies, which do a lot of the compounding in the United States. FDA has oversight over our outsourcing facilities. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the history of compounding and the FDA. Going back to 1997, about 30 years ago, Congress passed FDAMA, the Food and Drug Modernization Act, and for the first time, it added a new section to the FD&C Act, Section 503A, to address the compounding of drugs by pharmacists. And it included certain conditions that pharmacists had to meet in order for their drugs to be lawfully marketed. And what was the purpose of FDAMA? The purpose of FDAMA was to ensure the continued availability of compounded drug products as a component of individualized therapies while limiting the scope of compounding to prevent the manufacturing of drugs in large quantities under the guise of compounding. And so Section 503A set about the parameters and a framework for what pharmacists had to do and what conditions they had to meet for their drugs to be lawfully marketed in the US. Now, certain provisions, the Section 503A included a provision that said compounded unapproved drugs could not be advertised or marketed. And some pharmacies challenged the FDA, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court ruled that that provision of the law was unconstitutional as a violation of the First Amendment. So this caused some problems for the agency, and there were some conflicting circuit court opinions, and there was a cloud over the entire statute, which made it challenging for FDA to enforce. In the meantime, from 1997 on to 2012, there were a number of incidents that occurred that led to severe patient harm, including death. In 2012, there was a case where due to contaminated medication, that people developed fungal eye infections, and at least 29 patients suffered vision loss. So these are things that you really don't hear about as much because, if it's 2 or 3 patients, it may make the news locally, but it may not make national news. But there were a number of adverse experiences that folks had. But in 2012, as some of you may recall, there was the largest tragedy related to compounding in recent memory, and that was the case of the New England Compounding Center that was making a preservative-free methylprednisolone acetate that was being injected intrathecally into patients, and unfortunately it was contaminated. And there were 750 cases of illnesses in over 20 states and more than 60 deaths. And that picture there, I'm told, is actually not a stock photo, but is a photo that was actually taken during the investigation of this outbreak. And so what happens after this? After this, Congress held hearings, and then they passed new legislation called the Drug Quality and Security Act of 2013. And it cleaned up the statute by removing the unconstitutional provisions and developed a new framework for compounding by outsourcing facilities. Now, let me talk a little bit about the statutory framework for compounding. In the US, we have two types of compounders under federal law. So we have Section 503A compounders, and these would be your licensed pharmacists in a state licensed pharmacy or a federal facility or a licensed physician. And they can qualify for certain exemptions from the FD&C Act. On the other side, after 2013, we have outsourcing facilities, and those are allowed to compound more and are basically larger scale compounders. You'll notice that there's some key differences in the exemptions. The first two exemptions are the same for both types of compounders. So both types of compounders can become exempt from FDA approval and labeling with adequate directions for use. If you're a state licensed pharmacy, you also do not need to comply with current good manufacturing practices or CGMPs. It simply wouldn't be possible or feasible if you're doing, doing a medication for one patient. The difference is that outsourcing facilities, because they're allowed to compound larger quantities, are always subject to CGMP requirements. So that's one of the key differentiators between state licensed pharmacies and outsourcing facilities. Also, if you're an outsourcing facility, you can become exempt from certain drug supply chain security requirements in Section 582. Now, what happens if your drug product does not meet the conditions of either Section 503A or 503B? That means that then your product cannot qualify for the exemptions in the statute, which means at this point you are now making an unlicensed and unapproved new drug, and your drug product is now adulterated and or misbranded, which means that you're now committing either a misdemeanor or a felony under the FD&C Act for introducing into interstate commerce a drug that cannot legally be introduced. Okay, now what are some of the limits on compounding? What can you make if you're a compounder? And I'll kind of have these side by side. 503A, think state licensed pharmacy. Section 503B, think outsourcing facility. So FDA has a list of drug products that have been removed from the market for reasons of safety or effectiveness, and obviously those cannot be compounded. We don't want compounders to, make drugs that have been deemed to be unsafe or ineffective. Also, we have the so-called demonstrably difficult to compound list, or DDC list. Basically, FDA has the ability to have a class of products that should not be compounded because they're too complex. Currently, we have a proposed rule on that. I think one of the products we have are products made by hot melt extrusion. So we're in the process of reviewing the comments, and that hasn't been finalized yet. But that's an ability to basically carve out an entire class of products from compounding if we deem that they're not appropriate. Also, a big one is the essentially a copy provision. There are fairly similar provisions for both state licensed pharmacies and outsourcing facilities to ensure that they cannot make copies of FDA-approved drugs. We want to make sure that compounders don't undermine the FDA approval process by making what are essentially copies of FDA-approved drugs, because that would provide a disincentive for sponsors to invest the money to do the clinical research to get their drug to be FDA-approved. Also, patient-specific prescription is a big difference. State licensed pharmacies can generally only compound after the receipt of a patient-specific prescription to make sure that there's a clinical need, there's a learned intermediary that has made a determination that medication must be compounded and is appropriate for a patient. Section 503B are larger compounders, and they can make office stock, so they do not need to have patient-specific prescriptions for their products. The 5% limit, it's pretty complicated. It's tied up in litigation, so I'll kind of skip that. On the 503A side, on the 503B side, we have a prohibition on wholesaling. There is an exception for outsourcing facilities to wholesale drugs, to administer them in a healthcare setting or to dispense them pursuant to a prescription. And then also, we have what are called our bulks lists. Under Section 503A, we have a list of bulk drug substances that can be used in compounding. And then we have the same, a companion kind of provision on the 503B side. Okay, so what are some of these compounders under Section 503A, these state licensed pharmacies? They number in the many thousands. They don't have to register with FDA. We don't really know how many there are. They're primarily overseen by the State Board of Pharmacy. The frequency and depth of their oversight really varies by state. And the quality standards can vary by state. Some states follow, USP to the T, others just kind of pick and choose. And one thing, kind of a regulatory gray area, are these compounding physicians that are really not really overseen entirely by the Board of Medicine or really the Board of Pharmacy. They're kind of in a gray area. Now, what about outsourcing facilities? So outsourcing facilities are a creature of statute, and they are defined in the statute as a facility in one geographic location or address that is engaged in the compounding of sterile drug products. So this is important to note, to not gloss over. To be an outsourcing facility, you must make at least some sterile drug products. You cannot only make non-sterile products. You register with FDA, and then you comply with all the requirements of Section 503B. Currently, we have 96 outsourcing facilities. They're listed on our website along with contact information, as of last month. In addition, an outsourcing facility may or may not be a pharmacy. It does not need to register as a pharmacy. It probably has to register at the state level, and that really depends on how the state chooses to license it. Again, they may or may not obtain prescriptions. They can obtain prescriptions if they want to, but they're not required to. They are subject to FDA inspection, and all their products need to be made pursuant to CGMP. All right, now let me talk a little bit about the bulks list. So the question is, well, what bulk drug substance can you use to compound? And so FDA, I won't read the definition here, but we have a definition in the Code of Federal Regulations. It's important to know that we consider an active pharmaceutical ingredient and a bulk drug substance to be synonymous, the same thing. Okay, so what bulk drug substance can you use in compounding? For 503A, think state licensed pharmacy. So you have the option to compound with a bulk drug substance that is the subject of an applicable USP or NF monograph. If there's no monograph, then the active pharmaceutical ingredients need to be a component of an FDA-approved drug. And then if those two things don't exist, then if FDA has put it on the so-called 503A bulks list, then you can compound with it. So state licensed pharmacies actually have a pretty large range of things that they can compound with. All the FDA-approved drugs, many thousands, plus all the USP or NF monographs. On the 503B side, the outsourcing facilities, the larger scale compounders, it's much more limited. You can nominate something to be on the so-called 503B list, or you can make something if it's on the FDA drug shortage list. And the reason is that doesn't really undermine the approval process and may even provide an incentive for the sponsors to ramp up capacity to meet that need. We also have some interim policies, which I won't talk about in the interest of time. So how do nominators, or how do people nominate things for the bulks list? So we have a pretty similar process for both 503A and 503B. And so essentially what we do is we have nominators propose bulks to be used in compounding. And then we evaluate those nominations. We also, on the 503A side, we have our statutorily required advisory committee, the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee. We bring those substances to the committee and get their non-binding vote on that. And then we decide to either place the product on the list or the bulk on the list or not on the list. And our 503A bulks list is codified in the CFR. So how do we do our evaluation on the 503A side for bulk drug substances? So the information is all provided by the nominator. It's publicly available, peer-reviewed literature. We look at 4 factors: the physical and chemical characterization, the safety issues, raised by the use in compounded products, the evidence of effectiveness or lack of effectiveness, and the historical use of that substance in compounding. And then we consider all these factors and balance them out. And then we decide we want to, place this product on the list or not. We issue a proposed rule, we get comments on the proposed rule, we address the comments, and then we issue a final rule, either placing or not placing the product on the list. To date, we have 31 products that have been, or bulks that have been proposed for inclusion. 5 have been added, and 26 have been recommended against inclusion. And we're always working on this on a rolling basis. So here's our current list of products that are on the 503A bulks list. There's only 6. Keep in mind, there's already a huge universe of things that you can by right as a compounder make. On the 503B side, for the outsourcing facilities, it's very similar. We have, you have to qualify for the list, or the drug product has to be on the FDA drug shortage list. So how do we do it? We have a similar process. We have a docket open. Any member of the public and outsourcing facility can nominate a bulk drug substance for use in compounding. The one difference is we do not have to take the bulks that have been nominated for the outsourcing facilities to our advisory committee. We can if we want to, but we historically have not. And then the FDA 503B box list is listed on our website as well. So how do we do our evaluation of the box list? So we asked two questions. We asked, is there a clinical need for the outsourcing facility to compound this drug product? And then if the answer is yes, then we asked, must the drug product be compounded from a bulk drug substance? In other words, couldn't you just start with the FDA-approved product? So if you're making a lower concentration product, generally we would expect that you could just start with the FDA-approved product and dilute it to make a lower concentration product. All right, and then these are our products that are currently on the 503B box list. They're listed right there. It's also on our website. And then let me just conclude by kind of taking people through the differences between the FDA drug approval process and compounding. So on the left side, we have the FDA drug approval process. So how do you get your new drug approved? You have a sponsor who submits an application to FDA, and they submit substantial equivalence of effectiveness to show that the drug is safe and effective. They do clinical studies. The drug sponsor proposes either one or more indications, and then FDA reviews the CMC, the chemistry manufacturing controls, of the finished dosage form for that proposed product. On the left side, we have the box list product. We have a nomination by a member of the public, a pharmacy and outsourcing facility, anyone. The nominator submits public available information, peer-reviewed literature. They troll through PubMed and anything they can get. And then there's no requirement that they do any studies of their own. The nominator doesn't have indications. They have proposed uses. And I've seen as many as 20 plus proposed uses. Everything kind of runs the gamut. And then FDA evaluates not the finished drug product, but the actual bulk drug substance itself, and does not evaluate any drug product formulation or manufacturing. Again, going back to the new drug approval process, the labeling must meet the requirements in the Code of Federal Regulations. FDA generally perform a pre-market assessment of the sponsor's manufacturing facility, and then assuming that all checks out, the drug will become FDA approved, will get put in the Orange Book, and it can be sold in interstate commerce. On the compounding side, compounded drugs are exempt from labeling with adequate directions for use. However, outsourcing facility drugs are required to meet certain mandatory labeling that's listed in the statute in Section 503B. And among the things they need to put on their label is the phrase, quote, "This is a compounded drug," to alert providers and people to the fact that it's compounded and not FDA approved. FDA does not do an inspection of state licensed pharmacies generally. But FDA does conduct surveillance or for-cause inspections of state licensed pharmacies, and we inspect our outsourcing facilities according to a risk-based schedule. An inspection is not drug-specific. It would cover the entire facility. An important thing to highlight again is compounded drugs are not FDA approved. They cannot be equated with FDA approval. That would be a prohibited act. All right, I have some resources here, some really good guidance documents we have on our processes, on our evaluation processes. And then we have a really good website on human drug compounding. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to visit that to learn more. And then let me just leave you with this. If you're interested, we have kind of a listserv where you can sign up for. If you're interested on learning more about FDA's compounding policies, whenever there's a major announcement, you'll get an email about that if there's a new guidance document or other information. So thank you for the opportunity to present today.
Thank you, Dominic. I think we have I'm going to welcome Melanie Turen back to the podium. She is our other parent advocate who's here on behalf of the International Children's Advisory Network, and here to really share her unique insights based on her extensive experience and journey with her own son and her active engagement with other parent communities.
Great. Can everyone hear me? All right. So thank you, Mona, for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here with you all today, representing the caregiver perspective. As Mona said, my name is Melanie, and I am here on behalf of ICAN, the International Children's Advisory Network. Today, I would like to share what pediatric formulation development looks like at its final stage of implementation in our homes, to share what happens when medications leave the clinical world and caregivers must bridge the gap. I'll start by telling you a little bit more about myself. First and foremost, I am mom to a child with complex medical needs. My son, Teo, has Palazius-Merzbacher disease, a rare leukodystrophy that impairs myelination of the central nervous system. His daily comfort and stability rely heavily on pharmaceutical intervention and precise medication management. He receives all nutrition and most of his medications through a feeding tube. Teo specifically has a micro GJ button with a Yeyuno lumen of only 8 French. This makes enteral medication administration particularly challenging. On the plus side, we don't have to worry about palatability. In addition to being Teo's mom, I am also a mechanical engineer, and this skill set has come in handy as I have had to develop solutions to meet Teo's unmet needs. Advocating for Teo and children like him developed organically as I translated our lived experiences into spaces like this one here today, where medications, policies, and systems are designed. I have no formal medical training, but after 9 years caring for my son, I have developed extensive caregiver expertise that was born out of necessity and shaped by the realities of caring for my son at home. To better understand how this expertise developed, I'd like to show you what medication management looks like in our home. It's not that different from Crystal's. Instead of being in the kitchen, we're in the bathroom. And this isn't a pharmacy, this is our bathroom. We have color-coded labeled syringes, milligram scale, pill pulverizers, extraction needles, medication storage bottles with purple EN fit caps, a refrigerator that's dedicated to medications and enteral feeds, and drawers full of backup and PRN medications. I never intended to build a home pharmacy. It developed as we adapted to the demands of Teo's evolving needs. We manage 30 unique medications that are distributed over 56 individual administrations every day. Teo's daily regimen includes inhaled medications, commercially available liquids, compounded preparations, solid dosage forms, and 4 medications that we must modify at home. Each formulation comes with different access, preparation, and administration challenges. Medications are administered every 2 hours throughout the day and even overnight. Safely managing a regimen like this requires constant preparation, coordination, and adaptation. This is what, when caregivers become pharmacists, looks like in practice. So now that you've seen the reality of medication management in our home, I would like to share 3 unique case studies which highlight the different types of gaps that caregivers encounter. The first is a formulation availability gap. Transdermal clonidine patches are commercially available in doses of 0.1, 0.2, and 0.3 milligrams per day for a 7-day application. But for Teo, a 0.1 milligram per day dose is subtherapeutic, while a 0.2 milligram day dose causes floppiness and lethargy. The easy solution would be to cut the patch, but we all know transdermal patches cannot be cut. Additionally, we noticed that the therapeutic effect was not stable through the 7-day period. Teo would be extremely lethargic on day 1, but his spasticity was already returning by day 4. Other caregivers have noticed this pattern as well. So in preparing for this talk, I was curious whether I could find published data that confirmed our clinical observations. And I did. The graph comes from a peer-reviewed publication that measured plasma clonidine concentrations following application of a transdermal patch. The exact values here are not important. The trends are. The data shows an early peak in drug exposure, followed by a decline over the next several days. These trends mirror what we had been observing. Knowing this didn't solve our problem. The commercially available doses still didn't meet Teo's needs. So I engineered a dose that did. So before we go into the engineering solution, allow me to take the published data one step further. I promise I'll tie this back in later. Here, I've simply extrapolated the published data beyond a single patch cycle. The solid red line is the original 7-day profile from the publication, and the dotted black line extends those data over 21 days, assuming the patches are replaced every 7 days according to label instructions. Okay, now let me go back to the solution. In response to our observations, I developed an overlapping patch strategy. We apply a partially exposed patch, which we do by removing only half of the backing on day 0. We then increase the exposure of that patch 2 days later by removing the other half of the backing. On day 4, we introduce another half patch before the first patch loses effectiveness. And on day 6, we increase the exposure of the second patch and we remove the first patch. This then repeats in a 4-day cycle. Clinically, we have found that this approach provides consistent symptom control and effectively manages Teo's spasticity. Now, as an engineer, I wondered what would happen if I applied the published data that I had extrapolated to our solution. What you can see is that the overlapping strategy flattens the peaks and valleys and produces a more stable concentration profile that stays within the therapeutic window. It was incredibly validating to see that the published data reinforced what we had been observing clinically. This is what happens when commercially available options don't meet real-world needs. Caregivers must bridge the gap. This next case study looks at what happens when the right formulation exists but can't be accessed. When we were living in Germany, we used a liquid dronabinol formulation that was appropriate for enteral administration. After moving to the US, we transitioned to Syndros, which was the only FDA-approved liquid. But then the manufacturer went bankrupt and Syndros disappeared from the market. The remaining options were gel capsules that are unsuitable for enteral administration or recreational tinctures that lacked FDA oversight. The formulation we need exists, we just can't access it. Teo's needs did not change, but the responsibility of meeting them shifted to us. We were able to obtain the commercially available gel capsules in the correct dose, but we still had to figure out how to transform a gel capsule into a form that can be administered through a feeding tube. So once again, I engineered a solution. Here's the process that we implement in our bathroom pharmacy. First, we soak the capsules in water to soften the shell. Then we extract the oil using a large bore needle. We consolidate the contents into a single stock preparation. And finally, each day we suspend the oil in food so that it can be administered through a J tube. Does a caregiver having to go to these lengths at home make you uncomfortable? Well, it should. There is a paradox here. A physician prescribed the medication. A pharmacist dispensed it. Both of them know that Teo is tube dependent and NPO, but neither one provided instructions for how to administer the medication safely through a feeding tube. A caregiver had to engineer the solution. When the right formulation isn't accessible, caregivers bridge the gap. So we've now discussed a case where available formulations didn't meet the clinical need, and a case where the right formulation existed but couldn't be accessed. Next, I will discuss a case of system failure. Later in this session, you'll hear from Shannon about adverse event reports involving compounded clonidine. Those reports are understandably and necessarily brief and anonymized. But here, I have the opportunity to share the real story behind one such adverse event. With permission from the family, I'll be sharing screenshots captured by a camera in the child's room that recorded these events as they unfolded. This is Evelyn. She is 21 months old and lives with her parents in Chicago. Evelyn receives clonidine each night to help her sleep. One evening, after giving clonidine from a new bottle, her mom noticed that she wasn't responding normally. Evelyn was difficult to rouse. She was agitated. Her eyes were rolling back in her head. Mom suspected a seizure, so she administered an emergency dose of rectal diazepam. Evelyn didn't improve. At that point, 911 was called and Evelyn was transported to the hospital. On the way, she stopped breathing, her heart rate dropped, and she required bagging and chest compressions. Once Evelyn arrived at the hospital, she was intubated and admitted to the PICU. Sometimes there is no gap for caregivers to bridge. We must rely on the system. And when that happens, the system must be reliable. So let's go back. Prior to administering the clonidine, Evelyn's mom had noticed that the bottle contents looked different from her previous bottles. She questioned the appearance, but she double-checked the label and showed that the concentration was as prescribed. However, Evelyn had recently transitioned to a ketogenic diet, so a lot of her medications had changed appearance due to formulation differences. As Evelyn's condition worsened, Mom continued to suspect that clonidine was the culprit, and she actually brought the hot bottle with her to the hospital. Based on her concern for a clonidine overdose, Narcan was administered while the doctors tried to understand what was happening. Her mom repeatedly contacted the compounding pharmacy and was reassured that all protocols had been followed and that the concentration was correct. She then had a reasonable request for the hospital. Can you measure the concentration of this bottle? But she was told, this is not an episode of House. Ultimately, the bottle was sent to an outside independent lab for testing. The lab found that the clonidine concentration was approximately 2,000 times higher than prescribed. Let that sink in. It is incredible that Evelyn survived. She spent 8 days in the hospital before finally returning home. Today, Evelyn is thriving. But this outcome doesn't change the lesson. No system is perfect and errors are inevitable. The system eventually found the error, but not on its own. A caregiver recognized it first. Better systems take caregiver concerns seriously and are resilient enough to respond when something doesn't seem right. Up to this point, I've shared stories from individual families, but I was curious to know whether our experiences were shared in the broader community. So I conducted a survey. I surveyed more than 50 caregivers of children with medical complexities across the US and internationally. They answered questions about medication modification, access barriers, caregiver burden, and stakeholder responsibility. They were also given an opportunity to share their experiences in their own words, and you will see some of those words throughout the next slides. I then analyzed the data and identified recurring themes. The first theme that emerged is that medication modification isn't rare, it's routine. Caregivers are splitting, crushing, weighing, mixing, extracting, dissolving medications on a regular basis. And this isn't just happening in a few homes. 82% of caregivers surveyed modified medications at least once a day, and 2/3 do so multiple times per day. For most families, medication modification isn't the exception, it's the norm. And that raises an important question. If medication modification has become routine, who is teaching caregivers how to do it safely? When asked whether they were provided instructions on how to modify medications at home, nearly half of caregivers reported receiving little to no guidance. Just over 1/3 received verbal instruction, and only 14% received written instructions. Caregivers are expected to perform increasingly complex medication tasks while receiving limited, inconsistent guidance on how to do this safely. This raises concerns about medication safety. It raises concerns about dosing accuracy. It highlights the need for caregiver training, and it underscores the lack of standardization of care and how medication preparation is taught and supported. The issue isn't simply that caregivers must modify medications. It's that caregivers are often expected to figure it out on our own. The next theme showed that what systems often perceive one way, caregivers experience differently. Here we have a medication that exists in a suitable form and appropriate dose for pediatric administration. From the system's perspective, the problem appears solved. But from a caregiver's perspective, availability is only the beginning. A medication may exist, but it may not be covered by insurance. It may require prior authorization. There may be a shortage or back order. If it needs to be compounded, these pharmacies can be difficult to access. And then, even when all of those barriers are navigated, the remaining out-of-pocket cost may simply be prohibited for many families. Each barrier increases the distance between a prescribed medication and a medication that can actually be given to a child. In short, a medication that cannot be accessed is functionally unavailable. And that's the difference between what systems often perceive as administrative processes and what caregivers experience as barriers to accessing their child's medications. So which stakeholders do caregivers perceive as responsible for these access barriers? I allowed respondents to select multiple answers because I know we couldn't just pick one. Insurance was identified most frequently, but the perceived responsibility was actually distributed across all stakeholders. The answers showed that no single stakeholder is responsible, and that means no single stakeholder can close these gaps alone. All of these gaps, barriers, and responsibility I've discussed ultimately converge on one person, the caregiver. That's a very heavy burden to bear. So I wanted to know how caregivers felt about this and invited them to summarize their experience managing medications at home in one word. This is what they had to say. Overwhelming, exhausting, stressful, frustrating, challenging. These words are heavy, and they're heavy because our responsibilities are heavy. We would do anything for our children. The question is whether the system is doing everything it can for them too. So what have we learned up to now? Medication modification is the norm, not the exception. Caregivers develop solutions that systems do not provide. Availability does not guarantee accessibility. Responsibility for bridging gaps frequently shifts to families. And perhaps most importantly, these challenges are systemic. They are not the result of individual failures. They are recurring patterns seen across our healthcare ecosystem. And if the challenges are systemic, then the solutions must also be systemic. So I'd like to end today by looking ahead at how we can build better systems together. We've seen what caregivers do every day to manage medications. The question is not whether caregivers can bridge the gap. We already do. The question is how we build better systems so that when gaps inevitably arise, and they will, caregivers are not left to bridge them alone. And to address this, we first need to address what better actually means. Better does not mean perfect. Gaps will always exist. Off-label use and medication modification are simply realities of pediatric care. Families and clinicians must frequently work outside of idealized scenarios. To me, Better means resilient systems that are designed for the real world. Systems that anticipate reality rather than assume perfection. Systems that are designed around how care actually happens. Better systems respond safely and support families when gaps arise. And better systems include caregivers in the solution. Caregivers of children with medical complexity often feel unseen and unsupported. But there is hope on the horizon. Being invited here today to represent the caregiver perspective reflects a meaningful shift. It reflects growing recognition that our experiences and expertise are valuable forms of knowledge. It reflects that we are viewed not simply as recipients of care, but as essential partners in care. And it reflects a growing commitment to building better systems together. The goal isn't perfect systems. It is resilient systems that are built with caregivers and that are designed for reality. On behalf of our community, thank you all for welcoming caregivers into this space.
We're going to go ahead and resume session 1A so we can stay on track here on time. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Shannon Glueck. Dr. Glueck is a pharmacist who currently serves as a branch chief in the Division of Compounding 2 within the Office of Compounding Quality and Compliance at FDA. In this position, she oversees the surveillance and investigation of adverse events and product quality issues involving compounded drugs and implements prompt agency action to mitigate potential risks to public health. She also evaluates compounded drug products for compliance with the conditions of Sections 503A and 503B of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Dr. Glueck's presentation will focus on examining error-related and spontaneous adverse events related to compounded medications for pediatric use.
Good morning. My name is Shannon Glueck, and I'm one of the branch chiefs in the Division of Compounding 2 in the Office of Compounding Quality and Compliance at the FDA. I'm going to talk to you today about pediatric compounded medication safety, examining error-related and spontaneous adverse events. And while I'll go over specific cases received by FDA, my own thoughts on the topic will be incorporated. These are the objectives that we'll go over. I won't go through them. My colleague Dominic has provided an overview of compounding. To pick up from there, I'm going to talk a little bit about incident reports that are received by FDA. FDA's compounding incidents program aims to protect the public against poor quality compounded drugs through surveillance and review of incidents, which include adverse event and product quality reports. And as the incidents program identifies risks related to compounded drugs, it takes action to mitigate these risks. And this often includes various types of communications and outreach to raise stakeholder and public awareness about risks related to human drug compounding. So let's start with the basics. What am I referring to when I talk about incidents? So incidents generally fall into two categories. There's adverse events or adverse drug experiences that are defined in regulations, and there's complaints. An adverse drug experience is any adverse event associated with the use of a drug in humans, whether or not it's considered drug-related. And this includes adverse events occurring in the course of the use of the drug product in professional practice, occurring from drug overdose, whether accidental or intentional, occurring from drug abuse, drug withdrawal, or any failure of expected pharmacological action. And complaints are other reports where an adverse event did not occur. And complaints can fall into a wide range of issues. We see product quality issues such as contamination, particulate matter, pH issues. There's complaints of unsanitary conditions within a facility or failure of an outsourcing facility to comply with CGMP requirements. These are just some examples of types of reports that might fall into that complaint category. So let's briefly talk about adverse event reporting obligations to provide some context into what FDA receives and the challenges that we have with receiving reports. So there are generally, two types of adverse event reporting. We have voluntary reporting and mandatory reporting. Section 503BB5 of the FD&C Act, there will not be a quiz. It requires outsourcing facilities to report adverse events under 21 CFR 310-305. And this requires manufacturers, packagers, and distributors of marketed prescription drug products that are not the subject of an FDA-approved new drug application or abbreviated new drug application to report to FDA all serious and unexpected adverse drug events associated with the use of their drug products. And these must be submitted to FDA within 15 calendar days of receipt of the serious and unexpected adverse event. In addition, all serious, unexpected adverse drug experiences that are the subject of these reports must be promptly investigated by the outsourcing facility, and a follow-up report must be submitted within 15 calendar days of receipt of the new information or as requested by FDA. Now, voluntary reporting. So voluntary reporting is primarily done through things like the MedWatch program, which you have probably heard of, but there are other avenues for, reporting voluntarily to FDA. And consumers and patients can go online and submit these MedWatch reports to FDA. Healthcare professionals, physicians, nurses, pharmacists, et cetera, you could also go and submit these reports using a MedWatch Form 3500. And this may also include reports from pharmacies or physicians that compound drugs under Section 503A. Though what we've seen is that 503A facilities generally do not submit reports of adverse events to FDA. So why do I bring this up? Well, all of the case reports that I will discuss today were related to facilities compounding under Section 503A. And 503A compounders may perform the bulk of individualized compounding of drugs for pediatric patients. And we know from the previous slide that the FDA typically receives reports related to drugs compounded under 503A from voluntary reporting mechanisms. So what we can extrapolate is that there is a severe underreporting of adverse events related to compounded drugs in the pediatric population. And the reports that we do receive, they're very limited in details. Causality and root causes may not be able to be determined based on the limited information that we receive, and the rates of occurrence cannot be established. So given the underreporting and the low quality data, we have very limited visibility into the small subset of adverse events in this population. And this limits FDA's ability to identify issues and trends occurring in the compounding space. So why are medications being compounded for pediatric use? You've heard a lot about this today. The needed formulations for pediatric patients may not exist as an FDA-approved drug. And so without compounding, these patients may not be able to receive the treatment that they need. And pediatric compounding opens the door to a wide range of medication formats that are designed specifically for children's needs. And they provide options that typically mass-produced medications rarely offer. Compounders can produce formulations and flavored suspensions and solutions that are easier, more tolerable for pediatric patients. Hopefully they're tastier. There's gummy and chewable forms that are more tolerable and make medicine feel a little less intimidating. There's lollipops, there's lozenges. They mimic things that kids generally like to eat. And it's not always easy to get a kid to take their medicine, and they may not be capable of taking it depending on the dosage form, which you've heard, again, a lot about today. FDA-approved products are not often available in the recommended dosages for pediatric patients, making compounding into the appropriate dosages necessary. But this also comes with risks, which we'll talk about. Some patients are allergic to or unable to tolerate certain ingredients in the FDA-approved product, if there is one. So it needs to be specially formulated without those ingredients for that specific patient. So that being said, compounded drugs serve an important medical need, and they're an essential part of the healthcare system. Compounding was meant to fill these gaps, but it does not come without risks. And the more gaps there are, the greater the opportunity there is for errors to occur. Compounded drugs pose additional safety risks because they are not evaluated by FDA for safety, effectiveness, or quality prior to marketing. Dominic spoke a lot about this earlier this morning. A compounding process can be susceptible to unique medication errors that may result in patient harm, including serious injury and death. And FDA has received cases of pediatric patients who are harmed because of errors related to compounded drugs. And this is why I'm here today. I'm a pharmacist, and my team and I see and investigate every day adverse events and product quality issues related to compounded drugs for pediatric and adult patients. And this includes, but is not limited to, medication errors. While my expertise is in compounding incidents and regulatory compliance, to be clear, I'm not a medication error expert or a pediatric drug expert specifically. We do have different areas in FDA for those expertise. What I'm going to talk to you about today are some of the things that I've seen in practice and at the FDA in the compounding incidence program. This quote was taken from an article published in 2020 in Integrated Pharmacy Research and Practice, and I think it sums it up nicely. While this paper was not about compounding specifically, the general idea still applies. The pediatric medication use process is complex and error-prone because of the multiple steps required in calculating, verifying, preparing, and administering doses. So let's talk a little bit about medication errors. Compounding errors can stem from many different things, and it may be a combination of many different things. And this is not meant to be an exhaustive list by any means, but it gives you a preview of some of the themes that we'll see in the cases. Calculation errors is an often seen and significant error that may occur during compounding, and you'll see examples of this. Ingredient substitutions, using the wrong active ingredient or starting material. That ties into formulation changes. Formulations and calculations will change depending on the starting materials, which we'll see examples of. And this goes hand in hand with calculation errors. Prescribing errors. A prescriber may order an incorrect dose for the patient. This may be driven by lack of standardized doses or a high reliance on individualized weight-based dosing in pediatrics, and also prescriber inexperience. Systemic factors. High workloads, interruptions, lack of training, it all contributes to mistakes and errors at all levels of the process, from prescribing to compounding to dispensing to administration. FDA has received cases of pediatric patients who are harmed because of errors, and I'll present some examples of some of the types of cases that we've received associated with compounded drugs for pediatric use. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about the themes and the root causes as we're aware of them, and we'll begin a conversation about what we can do. So first off, calculation errors, again, are one of the major errors that we see in compounding, in particular with compounded clonidine suspensions. We'll see some variations in this throughout the slides. So this first pediatric patient was discharged from the hospital with a prescription for compounded clonidine, 6 micrograms every 6 hours. The patient received 1 dose and was found later that day to have a heart rate in the 30s. EMS was called, chest compressions were done, the rate went up to the 80s. There was a 100-fold error in dosage of the compounded product. A similar case, 3-year-old patient was admitted to the ER as unresponsive and bradycardic after receiving their usual dose of compounded clonidine oral suspension from a newly refilled bottle. The patient experienced a rapid onset of depressed mental status, loss of muscle tone, and pallor within 15 minutes of receiving the dose. The caregiver noticed that the last bottle of clonidine was thicker and milkier. This one was thinner, clearer, much easier to shake. That should send up a red flag. The patient received approximately 800 times the intended dose. Looking at starting ingredients and how they factor into these errors, 3 pediatric patients developed symptoms including unconsciousness and unresponsiveness, unexplained crying fits, bradycardia, slow breathing rate, and pinpoint pupils. 2 of these patients were intubated. The symptoms developed after the first dose of a new clonidine prescription bottle. What we found is that when compounding, instead of crushing the clonidine tablets and diluting into solution, the process of which can generally be less prone to these calculation errors, the pharmacy used pure clonidine powder. And this changes the calculations needed for the correct formulation, since the API powder is much more concentrated, and it's a much smaller quantity that is harder to weigh is needed for the formulation. The estimated drug concentration that the patient received was around 1,000 times the prescribed concentration, and the patients were dosed in grams instead of milligrams. Another example related to the starting ingredients that is slightly different. This patient's mother contacted the pharmacy because the patient seemed more lethargic than usual after taking the dose of clonidine. The compounder reviewed their logs, and they reflected that everything was made and dispensed correctly. As part of that review, they also looked at the log for the trituration that was used, and they informed the patient's mother that everything looked correct, but they decided that they would send the product for testing anyway. The test results showed that the clonidine content was 2,842 micrograms per milliliter when it should have been 25 micrograms per milliliter. The compounder determined that it's possible that the pure clonidine powder API was used instead of the trituration when the prescription was prepared. The trituration is a diluted form, so it's much less concentrated than the pure API. And this could have happened because the bottles for the pure powder API and the trituration are very similar. and they were kept close to one another. So once the powder is poured from the bottle, the pure form cannot be distinguished in appearance or weight from the trituration. In this next case, the patient's mother contacted the pharmacy because the compounded guanfacine for her 7-year-old had different storage requirements and a different smell and consistency than previous fills. The staff pharmacist told her that it was likely that a new flavoring agent was used, but it was the same product. The 7-year-old patient had become extremely lethargic within 45 minutes, slept most of the day, refused to eat or drink. The patient was taken to the emergency room. It was initially assumed that the guanfacine had been filled as quantity. The pharmacy reviewed the preparation logs, and it was discovered that guanfacine was prepared in a concentration of 1 milligram per 1 milliliter instead of 1 milligram per 5 milliliters, or 0.2 milligrams per milliliter, resulting in a drug concentration that was 5 times the prescribed dose. A root cause analysis was performed at the pharmacy, and it was established that the titles of the compounding formulas were not standardized. There was a lookalike issue in selecting the correct formulation file at the pharmacy because they looked very similar. And the formulation files were later renamed by the pharmacy in a standardized format to mitigate this contributing factor. In this next example, the pharmacist was given a prescription to compound clonidine 0.1 milligram per milliliter suspension with dosing that was perceived as too high. The pharmacist called the physician to confirm the dosing, and the physician confirmed the concentration and dosage were accurate. The medication was compounded and dispensed as written. The patient's mother called the next day, stating that she was on the way to the emergency room with the child. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, FDA often received reports with limited information. So it seems likely, considering the details that were provided, that there was a prescribing error in calculating the proper dose for this pediatric patient that resulted in the patient receiving too much of the drug and resulted in an adverse event. Unfortunately, we have to make some assumptions with this. To preface this next case, FDA does not know whether a compounding error or other medication error led to this event. There's a 3-year-old patient who became unconscious, hallucinated, disoriented, inconsolable within 30 minutes of receiving compounded clonidine suspension from a newly refilled bottle. The medication appearance was significantly different from prior fills. The liquid was lighter, thinner than usual. Remember that as a red flag. The local hospital tested the patient for RSV, which was positive. No other testing was done. The patient was discharged. The patient worsened at home and was instructed by the neurologist to go to a pediatric hospital. The second hospital started IVs, did x-rays, ultrasounds, administered 2 rounds of Narcan, admitted to the PICU, intubated, brain MRI, lumbar puncture, blood work. The diagnosis was bradycardia with suspected clonidine overdose. Hospital didn't test the product. The patient's mother could not test due to cost restraints. The reporter was lost to follow-up, so we haven't gotten more information about this. But I'm including this case here for a couple of reasons. One is an example of the many reports that FDA may receive where an error is suspected but cannot be confirmed. And 2, to highlight the need for healthcare professionals to consider the possibility of a compounding error when evaluating patients presenting for treatment of certain symptoms. It should be kept in the back of your mind as a possibility so that patients can receive the appropriate care when presenting with symptoms resembling an overdose. And finally, this is my last case example. A physician reported that a 5-year-old patient had stable graft function for 4 years. A second patient was stable for 10 years. The patients converted to compounded tacrolimus suspension for insurance reasons. Both experienced kidney transplant rejection requiring hospitalization and immunosuppression treatment. The reporter attributed this to formulation differences between branded and compounded products. And this is not a medication error as far as we are aware. We've also received other reports of unexpected supratherapeutic tacrolimus levels with compounded tacrolimus products where the products were tested and the analyses were within specification. But these cases highlight the potential dangers of switching between different formulations of a drug, particularly one with a narrow therapeutic index. And dosing adjustments and close monitoring may be necessary in these patients. And cost generally should not be a reason to use a compounded drug when an FDA-approved drug is available. So what themes do we see in the examples? Many of these cases reported that it was the first dose of a new bottle. That's often when you'll see these adverse events. The product looked different. In some of the examples, the caregiver questioned the look and texture of the product. but not until it was too late and an adverse event had already occurred. Caregiver education should include not only how to administer products, but what to do if something doesn't look right, and healthcare providers should take these concerns seriously. We saw compounding errors that are likely the result of misplaced decimal points, not adjusting formulations when using different starting materials like tablets or triturations or pure API powder, using the wrong compounding formulation, storing ingredients together, making it easier to grab the wrong product, lack of a verification and double check process for the ingredients used in the calculations. Always check and double check calculations. There was a potential prescriber error in the dose prescribed to the patient. Many of the reports of adverse events are related to clonidine. We see this relatively frequently, and I've linked to some of the references to communications about this on the last slide. Clonidine has a narrow therapeutic index, meaning small dosage variations can cause severe toxicity, especially in children. What we're seeing is 10, 100, 1,000-fold errors in concentration. While medication errors and adverse event reports such as these are not limited to pediatric patients, errors can make a huge impact in this patient population who may not be able to communicate how they're feeling to their caregivers or their healthcare professionals and receive the proper medical attention that they need. And this isn't to say that these errors are not occurring with other drugs. The seriousness of the adverse events may or may not be as extreme with other drugs. But what it further supports to me is that there is a lack of reporting of adverse events to FDA. And we only see what's reported to us. So it's very important that healthcare professionals and consumers report adverse events involving compounded drugs to FDA. So what are some of the needs that can be addressed? So I already talked about reporting to FDA, but I cannot stress enough how important it is. This is how we get important information, and it's critical to our risk-based approach and informs our actions. Proactive monitoring of compounded medicines could help to improve the safety of pediatric medicine use, monitoring the types and causes of errors, monitoring patients, as we saw in the case of tacrolimus. These stories highlight the need for increased safety in compounding and more education about the risks of errors, as well as the need for a commercially available pediatric formulation. You've heard and will continue to hear from parents and advocates who have incredible stories to tell. I'm an FDA employee, one of the regulatory experts in the compounding space. I'm a pharmacist by training, but I'm also a mother. My daughter was born with a medical condition that required treatment as a baby. We started off with the FDA-approved drug to treat the condition. It had intolerable side effects, but ones that we can anticipate and were educated on. I knew what to look out for, and I communicated with her doctor. The second option that we had was a compounded suspension. Having failed the FDA-approved drug with little alternatives, I'm eternally grateful that there was another option for my baby through compounding. As a pharmacist, I know how easy it is to make even a dispensing error when there is no compounding involved. So I am one to always double check the imprint on every tablet, double check every label to ensure that I'm getting the right medication at the pharmacy. But this was a compounded suspension. There was no FDA-approved labeling on the bottle that I could review. I couldn't double check any imprints. I had to just trust that it was right. And as we've discussed, the compounding process adds more opportunities for errors to occur than simply dispensing an FDA-approved drug. And when I tell you how much anxiety I felt every day when I gave a dose from a new bottle, I just can't even describe how that felt in that level of anxiety, especially when I see these reports every day. Thankfully, we had no issues with our compounded drug, but as we see, that's not always the case. So as I started out at the beginning of this presentation, compounded drugs serve an important medical need, and they are an essential part of our healthcare system. Compounding was meant to fill these gaps, but it does not come without risks, and we need to be aware of them and take proactive measures where we can. So hopefully this gives you a better idea of some of the adverse event reports and medication errors that we've received at FDA in the compounding office, and I look forward to the continued conversation and hopefully the action that comes from these conversations. Thank you for your time today.
Okay. We're going to invite Dr. Rachel Meyers. She's our last speaker for this session. Dr. Meyers is a clinical professor at the Ernest Mario School of Pharmacy at Rutgers University and a peds clinical pharmacist at Cooperman Barnabas Medical Center. Her research interests are focused on dosage forms for pediatric patients and medication safety for children. And today she will be sharing real-world challenges with preparing and administering dosage forms to the pediatric population from the perspective of a pediatric pharmacist.
This little computer.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, for being here. I'm always excited to talk about dosage forms for children. I think in my experience as a pediatric pharmacist for almost 20 years now, it always struck me as interesting that part of our training and the way we sort of behave as pediatric pharmacists is a lot of the things that we have don't work for us. And these are the workarounds. This is what you do. And so I'm trying to bridge that gap and sort of advocate and show you what we do day to day. I also just want to say another side note. Part of my experience is that I have been a patient in a clinical trial twice. And my experiences were horrifying as a patient. So for example, I received no written information outside of the consent. I actually took my medication incorrectly for the first few weeks because there was no written information. So I sort of have that background as well as sort of seeing how this side of drug development. It was absolutely fascinating as a pharmacist to go through that process. But that's a talk for another day. So today we're going to talk about medications that we have out there. I could talk all day about this, and I have 15 minutes. So I'm going to try to just give you some examples. I am not trying to target any particular drug company. I'm just showing you a glance into some of the things that we do. And I did want to share some wins, some things that have gone well. I think we're trying to show how we have had some progress in the last 10 years and talk about some ongoing issues. So what's not working? This is my first time using AI to make a picture, so I'm very proud of it. I'm trying to incorporate it into every presentation that I give. I said to my friend at work, why is there a cloud on his medication bottle? I didn't tell it to do that. And she said, well, it's because he's under the weather. So there you go. Anyway, so this is the way we gave medicine for a long time to kids, right? Using spoons and yucky tasting. So that's part of what's not working. Clindamycin is my usual example. It's a very common oral antibiotic that we give. It's classic in terms of the problems we have with liquids. It's very bitter. It also smells. When I was a pharmacy student working as a technician in an IV room, I dropped a bottle of the IV vial of clindamycin, and my colleagues were very unhappy with me because it's the drug itself. It smells, and the whole IV room smelled all day. So the problems with it as a liquid, again, taste, smell, but also it's very dilute. So these are kids that end up needing to take very large volumes. I gave some examples here. You know, a 12-month-old is going to take 6.7 mLs. That's too much volume. That may not sound like a lot, but for a 12-month-old, that is a lot. 3 times a day for 10 days is too much. And then 5-year-old, anything more than 10, I'm starting to question that we are not doing the right drug here. This is 13 mLs 3 times a day. And again, it's frequent dosing. Usually this is my winner when I have my medical residents. I always make them taste the antibiotics because I feel like as a pediatrician, they need to know what they are dealing with and what they are sending parents home with. Because again, the title of my talk is Welcome to the Jungle, and they need to know what the jungle looks like. And so I did this like 2 weeks ago, and the Clinda, they agreed, was not good, but azithromycin was actually the winner in terms of poor taste. Now, fortunately, azithromycin is only 5 doses. So once a day for 5 days. I found with my kids when they were on it, by the time we got to the next day, they kind of forgotten that it didn't taste so good. And by the time they started catching on and remembering, we were almost on therapy. So that's the advantage with azithro. But Clinda is always still my example. Other problems with liquids, there was an example in the last talk about compounding, milligram per ml versus per 5 ml. We have to stop doing things per 5 ml. No one needs that information. No one cares about how much is in 5 mLs. It is completely useless. We don't dose in teaspoons anymore, right? So all you're doing is making more math for us. And in pediatrics, we have enough math. I don't need any more. Just last week, my pharmacy resident, I asked him to calculate what dose he would like to send a patient home on with an antibiotic, and he calculated it wrong because he forgot to divide by 5. Okay, so we shouldn't be expecting this extra dose. It's 1980s medicine, and we're beyond that. So I love this poster from CDC. Spoons are for soup and milliliters are for medicine, and we should be dosing in milliliters and not in teaspoons anymore. That being said, it's a culture thing. My sister was checking a dose with me because that's what my sisters do whenever they get prescriptions from their pediatricians. She said, oh, my pediatrician told me to give a half a teaspoon of Zyrtec to the baby. And I said, please tell me that your pediatrician didn't actually tell you the dose in teaspoons. And she said, yep. Yes, she did. So again, it's a culture thing, but I would love it if on the labels, it could be listed per ml. Other problems that we have with oral syringes though, first of all, in terms of health literacy, they are harder to use, right? So there is some training involved and some parents need to be shown how to use them. The other issue is this, and this is what shocked me as a parent who had kids with lots of ear infections, is in the hospital, what we do is on the right. We have those adapters on the bottle, and they're often called flow restrictors, especially by folks from CDC who are very concerned about overdoses and toxicity, because it limits the amount that can come out of the bottle at any given time. But in the hospital, we use them to drop doses. Most prescription bottles do not come with those in the outpatient environment. So by the time you get halfway down the bottle, the syringe can't reach the liquid anymore. And so then what you're doing is some parents are pouring it into the cap. I have these little like spice bowls that I use at home. You pour it into the spice bowl and then you suck up your dose, but then you have to get the rest back into the bottle. And I was trying to explain this to my pediatrician. I said, I cannot get more than 8.5 days of doses. You wrote for 10 days. It doesn't last for 10 days because of this kind of stuff. So we can't, it sounds like, oh, you give the syringe and the parent can draw it. They can only draw it comfortably for the first 5 days. And a lot of pharmacies, unfortunately, do not provide oral syringes. I got an antibiotic for my daughter, and I remember the dose was 3 mLs. I got home, I opened the bag, there was no syringe in there. So now it's me, so I have 100 at home, so it's fine. But the pharmacist didn't know who I was, right? So how was I going to be giving that to my child? So there's a lot of issues that we have with liquids. This is one of my favorite. We still do this today, nifedipine, immediate release capsules. We use this for urgent hypertension in our kids who don't have an IV line. And the way it comes is these capsules. And so there is, I want to say, 0.3 mLs in one capsule. And that's a 10 milligram capsule. And sometimes my nephrologist will write for 1 milligram. So Matt, that means the nurse has to take what's out of the capsule and then divide by 10. So now we're talking 0.03 mLs. So that's just going to get stuck in the needle, right? It's not even going to reach the patient. So this is how we're jerry-rigging the dosage forms that are out there for our kids. This is one of my favorite sort of more recent fail stories, which is QVAR. QVAR has been on the market. It's an inhaled corticosteroid for asthma. It's been on the market for many years. Originally, it was available as a classic multi-dose inhaler, right? MDI, where you can put a spacer on it, you press the button. So even for littler kids, we used it very frequently with a spacer and even a mask for smaller kids. The company reformulated it as a breath-actuated inhaler. I'm not sure the year, maybe 5 years ago. And a lot of insurance companies, this is their preferred ICS, okay? The way it is given is you flip off that white cap, you form a seal, and you take a deep breath. And that deep breath is what triggers the release of the dose. It is FDA approved down to age 4. A 4-year-old cannot do that. Our pulmonologists tell us their minimum is 8. But insurance companies see, oh, it's approved down to 4. So we've had patients come in who are even less than 4, and that's the only thing their insurance company will cover, and they can't give it. Now, there are videos on YouTube of how to take this apart to make it spray for little kids. So you know there's a problem if there's a YouTube video about how to take it apart. Okay. We had a child come in, she was 2, and into our pediatric ICU. And I still remember we were rounding with the whole team. The mother was in tears, and she said to the team, ever since my insurance company changed our inhaler to QVAR, I've been in the emergency room once a month since we changed, because her child's not getting the medicine, right? So we switched her to a higher level medicine. We switched her to Symbicort, which is probably more medicine than she needed, but at least it was an MDI, and I could feel comfortable knowing she was going to get the medicine. But sometimes we're restricted by these formulary decisions, and the formulary decisions are often made because this is approved down to a 4-year-old. Now, this was a 2-year-old that was using it. But again, we don't trust this medicine until they're 8. So again, FDA approved, but not appropriate. I thought it was interesting that we started the day with a discussion of how ethanol wasn't in a medication, and that's what caused the investigation. But one of my, soapboxes is on ethanol use. We did this project a few years ago and published it where I had a pharmacy student do this, where we looked at all of the medicines we had been using in the hospital in kids and what the blood alcohol content would be of the child after a dose. So I don't know if you can see the one I like to point out. I don't know where my pointer is, but the phenobarbital, which is kind of halfway down. Phenobarbital is anywhere from 13.5 to 15% ethanol. And you can see that the blood alcohol levels that it causes are around 16 to 30. Okay, in the United States, you can't drink if you get to 80. So we are almost halfway to not being able to drive. And we're giving this medicine twice a day to babies in the NICU, and they're on it for years, right? So that medicine, that's my least favorite, I think, of all medicines, because of the ethanol content. And there's a compounded recipe that is ethanol free. But because this is available commercially, here's where compounding, right, provides that advantage. I can't even convince my own health system, my own hospital, to compound it, because it's so much easier, especially since it's a controlled substance, to just buy the commercial. So anyway, a problem. Another ethanol example, my other favorite, is dexamethasone. We use this all the time in our emergency department, especially this time of year, and in the fall, we have all our patients with asthma coming in, and we give them a high dose of dexamethasone. If we use the commercially available formulation, it is 5% ethanol, not as bad as phenobarbital, but it would bring their blood alcohol content, I did the math there for you, but to 50. And again, 80 is our limit in the United States for being able to drive. So this is not something we do. Also, just a note that the dose would be 60 mLs, and a 10-kilo patient is usually about 12 months old. No 12-month-old is going to take 60 mLs. So this dosage form doesn't work for us. We use the parenteral product, which is 10 milligram per ml and is alcohol free. So now my 60 ml dose is 0.6 mLs and has no alcohol. Beautiful, like problem solved. But this is the kind of stuff we're doing in pediatrics because what we have out there doesn't work. The other issue with this problem is solved for us in the hospital, but we can't do this in the outpatient environment because most retail pharmacies don't have the parenteral product. So they have to either use a different drug or they have to use tablets. Or I know from friends who work in community pharmacy, there are pediatricians who maybe aren't aware of this and are prescribing this elixir for kids in the outpatient environment. So it's really a problem. My other issue is with hazardous drugs. NIOSH is, of course, by definition, very concerned with occupational safety and health. And they have this list of drugs that for those of us who work in healthcare, we have to take precautions, okay? One of these drugs, for my example here, is tacrolimus. At my hospital, we're a very large kidney transplant center. We transplant several children every year. We do close to 400 kidney transplants every year in adults and kids. Probably about 10 or so are children every year. But
work in the transplant clinic, and I counsel these parents on a regular basis. So this drug is on this list. And the recommendation for oral liquids, if you see here, is to wear a double chemotherapy gloves and a protective gown. And you should wear eye, face, hair, sleeve, and shoe protection if there's likely to be a splash, which in Peds world I read as spitting, right? Which can happen. Okay, so this is what our nurses must do to give any doses. Here's a picture from the package insert of a parent preparing the tacrolimus. No gloves, nothing, no protection at all. The nurse is going to take care of the patient for her shift, 2 doses in the day. Mom and dad are doing this at home twice a day for years. We are transplanting kids as young as a year old. And so until the kid is able to do it themselves or switch to the capsule, parents are handling this and mixing this every day, twice a day, with no protection at all. So in my practice, when I'm counseling these parents, I tell them, please just wear gloves. And then we have to have the conversation of, why do I have to wear gloves and my kid's going to swallow this? Like, and I have to explain sort of the risk benefit ratio there, and that there's no benefit of this drug to them. And so in my opinion, any risk to the parent is not acceptable. Now, I'm not telling them to go out and buy chemotherapy gowns or anything like that. But this is sort of just this big disconnect with what's happening at home and what's happening in our healthcare hospital settings. So some wins. This is one of my favorites. I always tell my students the nose is the new hot route these days. We're putting everything up there. I love this Neffy. It's epinephrine for anaphylaxis. There's a lot of folks out there who have allergies who there's a barrier with giving an injection, right? There's a hesitation. My brother-in-law thinks it's better to just walk down the street to the hospital. He lives in Boston, than give himself his EpiPen. I'm like, just give the EpiPen before you go to the hospital. Still go to the hospital, but just give it. And I really think I want him to switch to this because I think there is just less fear involved in that. So I love the new nasal formulations. The granules, again, this is just one of my examples. Again, there's not that many out there in the United States yet, but this is one that's for cystic fibrosis. I think these offer a great, you have taste masking issues. Your issues with measuring are good because you're in the packet instead of having to measure it by the family. So I love granules, mini tablets, whatever we want to call them. This is another one, Maviret, that came out. I just love the instructions and the level of detail that it provides. And this just goes through the rest of how to make it, what foods to give it with, not to chew it, all those things. So in summary, I just want to finish with one more case. And this happened, I think it was last week. We had a patient come in with epilepsy. And I was reviewing the history and the doses that the nurse practitioner for epilepsy had put in. And I called her and I said, this does not match. The vigabatrin concentration and then the milligram doses that you're entering, they do not match at all. And so what had happened was the mom was mixing vigabatrin differently at home than the package instructions, because the volume the package instructions has you mix it at was too much for her baby. So she was double concentrating it. And so fortunately, we figured that out between the nurse practitioner and me. We figured out what she was doing, how much the baby was getting, how much she was supposed to be on, and we got it straightened out. But parents are going to flex, right? If the instructions that they're given don't work for their kid and are unreasonable. So we have to think about that and talk to parents about what works. Devices have issues too. We have to remember the safety for our caregivers who are handling this. I think that's something that really hasn't been touched upon. And solid oral dosage forms, I think, are great, and I'm a big fan, but we have to be worried about things like tubes for our kids with chronic illnesses who are on these for a long term. And something I've noticed is that there's just not a lot of data in the United States specifically. So I got a chance to speak at the American Academy of Pediatrics in the fall about new dosage forms. And a lot of these pediatricians and their general pediatricians haven't heard of mini tablets and granules. They're very concerned about choking and the acceptability in young children because a lot of the products that are on the market now are in very niche areas, right? If you're a pulmonologist, you know about Orkambi and Trikafta and all of that. If you're a GI doc, you know about the Hep C drugs that are coming out like that. But a general pediatrician has no idea. I will say they were very interested. And a pediatrician came up to me afterwards and said, I am so tired of having these conversations with parents about how to get their kids to take medicines. That should not be part of our conversation here. And so I think that's what we're trying to help change. So that's that. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Meyers. So that concludes the presentations for this first session. We're going to invite all our speakers to come down to the front of the room here, and we're going to begin our panel discussion. They're going to also be joined by Dr. Alyssa Hager, who is a clinical pharmacist at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C. She focuses on safe and sustainable medication design, utilizing innovative technology to guide appropriate medication practices, and is here also today to provide her unique insight, particularly with inpatient pharmacy practices in the neonatal population.